Welcome to Brand Enabled with me, Gabriel Cohen.
And with me, Holly Osborne.
This is where we talk with brand leaders willing to share the real-world lessons from being in the trenches.
Their triumphs and setbacks in the messy business of building brands.
These are the human stories behind branding that you will never find in any brief or case study. Holly, I am so excited about the first episode of this new series. I cannot imagine a better first conversation to do our first interview together with. Today we're talking to Monica Skipper, who is the VP of Brand, Head of Brand Management at FedEx for over 20 years.
Amazing. Monica has probably the closest thing to an encyclopedic, like if you wanted to learn about brand, sit and talk to Monica that's the plan here. But she holds the keys to the core principles of branding. And when I have a struggle or a challenge or a question, she's one of the first people that I would think to go to because she has seen every iteration of brand over her 20-year horizon there. It's pretty impressive.
I mean, let's just take a step back for a second, right? I mean, FedEx, created in 1971, it's colossal. Everyone knows FedEx.
Yeah.
530,000 employees, deliver 15.5 million packages a year. I mean, how many other brands do we know that have their brand on 670 aircraft that aren't one of the main airlines? They're in 220 countries. Everyone knows the iconic design of the FedEx logo where, you know, the hidden arrow in between the E and the X, which symbolizes speed and precision. Everyone knows the brand, so you got to remember that it's still a packaging logistics ops company, yet somehow brand is respected and at the forefront, because how else could they justify having a FedEx racing team, the huge golf sponsorship that they have, the Champions League sponsorship? Up until last year, you had FedEx Field in DC. So this is an organization that fundamentally believes in brand. So I'm so interested to hear from Monica, like, how does that come to be?
Yeah, and also I want her to talk to us about how she keeps control of this. I mean, it's just massive in scale, massive in reach. It's a springboard brand, meaning anywhere in the world you say that term, and it's known. But the other interesting thing too is she's earned with this brand, they've earned verb status. You know you're famous when somebody verbs you, when somebody FedExes, right, or Ubers, where they use the brand name in the action. Even if I'm sending it via DHL, let's be honest, I'm going to tell someone, I don't say I'm going to overnight it to you. I'm going to say I FedEx it to you. But I'm fascinated to find out how Monica manages control of this massive ecosystem, and the fact that they've had to stay consistent through 20, 30 plus years of global change.
Huge acquisitions. I mean, remember like Kinko's.
Oh, yeah. I remember that, FedEx Kinko's went up, changed my life for a few years. I think I lived at one during one particularly heavy project.
And I have a colleague who worked with Monica in the past, about 10 years ago. There's nothing but amazing things to say about her. But how did you meet her?
So Monica and I were in a group together called Brand 50. It's part of the World 50 conglomerate. And Monica was super cool because she represented this beacon of a massive, like I said, springboard brand. Everybody wanted answers from Monica. And yet what was also particularly cool about Monica is that she was the first to discuss vulnerabilities, and she was the first to discuss real challenges. And so she never handed you an answer that was polished and that was about shining a light on her successes. It was always about breaking it down and discussing the mistakes that had been made, the hard lessons learned, and then the outcome. And that's what makes Monica one of the most interesting brand leaders, is that she is in constant growth and learning mindset, not just looking to sort of package up a great story for the sake of a case study. So, I find her to be one of the most fascinating brand leaders and someone who's an open book who's going to probably reveal some pretty interesting things to us. You know, she's wise, she's courageous. That's something I appreciate a lot about her. She's got corporate courage, and is not afraid to tell you when something didn't work. She'd be the first to warn you off something as to send you in the right direction.
All right. Well, wonderful. Well, without further ado, let's listen and jump in and invite in our guest, Monica Skipper.
Let's do it.
We are so excited today to welcome Monica Skipper to the show, someone who is just going to give us an absolute wealth of knowledge after 20 years working at FedEx. And she has promised us that it's going to be completely unfiltered and we're going to get all the great stories, because now it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because you're not there anymore, so you can absolutely tell us everything, right, Monica?
Yeah, most things, except I can't disparage the company or they'd come after me.
Nor would we ever want to. It just allows us to talk about all those stories behind the hood. I mean, maybe just quickly give us a bit of a background on how you kind of even got to FedEx, how you got into this brand management role.
It's so funny because I'm one of few people who has a degree in marketing. My undergraduate and graduate degrees are both in marketing, and I've worked in marketing my whole life. So I'm kind of not the usual suspect. Anyway, I started out in database and direct marketing and just knew that I loved branding. I loved kind of the idea behind what makes people attracted to brands. And I was like, what's the best brand in Memphis that I could work for? I was like, FedEx. And so I applied for a job and actually went to work doing database and direct marketing at FedEx, hoping that I could move into a brand role, and was fortunate enough that the brand director said, yeah, you can come work for me. I made a few moves internally and got there. And she was a gem and had been at the company basically her whole career, was the first director of branding at FedEx ever. And when she retired, I was fortunate enough to get her role and then moved up in the company. And, when I retired, I had sponsorship, advertising, branding, and then at part of the time I had corporate reputation, corporate citizenship, which really does go with brand if you think about it.
I think one of the things that we're really excited about in this conversation is the fact that you were there for such a long time means that you went through so many changes, and that your experience of brand at FedEx in many ways matches how branding as a discipline has evolved in the last 20 years. The role that brand plays inside an organization. I mean, just before we started recording, we were talking about the Designing Brand Identity, which is Alina Wheeler's book, which is now in its 6th edition. And I think the brilliant thing about that book is that is also a great way to trace the evolution of brand, because every 4 years when Alina would come up with a new edition of Designing Brand Identity, it was intended to reflect, okay, how has branding changed? And it's a book that you're featured in. You're featured in as well. So maybe why don't we kind of start with that topic, and maybe talk about how did you see the role of brand change at FedEx in the time that you were there? What was its purpose and its remit when you started, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the evolution is true. I think, at the beginning, and fortunately, Fred Smith is definitely a visual and a brand champion. And so I was always fortunate enough to get to work with him, and that he understood basically the value of a strong brand. But really, if you think about it, most people 25 years ago thought of brand as a logo. That's really what people thought of. And it was like just your identity. Not really that a brand should be the expression of your business strategy and of who you are, right? I always say, be, do, say, right? Who are we? What are we going to be? Are we going to do that and do it well? And then how are we going to speak about it or express that? And so I think, at the very beginning of time, it was make sure the guidelines are out there, make sure there's some guardrails, make sure the colors are right or whatever. And it really blossomed into, how do we integrate businesses into our business? What do we call them? What's our strategy around that? How do we drive an experience that is one we want our customers to have? And how do we start talking about the brand experience, being kind of the sum of all of your experiences with a company rather than just your identity? We always internally use the hotel example. The sum of your experiences at pick any hotel chain. What was the reservation system like? If you had an issue, how did customer service respond? Did your digital key work when you got there? Were your non-feather pillows in the room, or did they So it's this whole idea that it moved from kind of an identity and some colors and some guardrails to what is the experience and how does that represent our business strategy?
And can you take us into how those moments happened? Were they driven by big events like some of the major acquisitions that happened? Was it based on a leadership change or slowly chipping away at internal leaders saying, no, we should be doing this? Like, take us into some of those moments of how those moments of evolution happen in the role that brand plays.
I think a lot of it was driven through acquisition. Because FedEx started as, expressing federal documents. There it's Federal Express, right? So it started out knowing who it was and what it was doing. And as it expanded beyond that, acquisition and really entry into new markets or new services and new, product lines really drove us to think about who we are. We didn't just express federal documents, right? And it was about the technology and the tracking and the information being almost as important as your actual package. And then it drove into, we were going to grow globally. And what did that mean to have a global footprint? And how did we think about our company in terms of, Federal Express is kind of difficult to say, especially in some regions. And so that's why we became FedEx, right? Acquisition, international acquisition. So a lot of times growth was the driver of those changes.
And Monica, I'm curious too, thinking about the category that you're in, the average person may not distinguish between one carrier and another, right? If there are multiple options and my objective is to get my document there, and I'm not aware of what goes on. As soon as I release it from my hands, it's in your hands. How did competitive differentiation come into play in how you chose to tell your story? How did you even begin to find a point of differentiation?
Well, I think the business found it, right? In terms of, I think way back, absolutely positively overnight. So in terms of quality and excellence in our service, that really was a differentiator. And then being the first to launch tracking, we had a lot of we were the leader and had a lot of fast followers. And so it's this idea that, when we said that the information about the package was almost as important as the package, all of a sudden people are like, oh, yeah, it is. Because if I know where it is, I can trust that it's coming. All of that built the brand over time. So it was our operational excellence along with the information about that built that trust. And I think differentiation, back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I'm curious too, when you start to build out when you go from a logo, right, and someone who supports brand in terms of, looking sharp and having a sharp system, how did you evolve into the company actually having an ethos? And what was that process like, where it was, the idea of experience and really building, for example, things like a mission, a vision, a purpose? How did you help that become important also at FedEx?
I think I hate to say it this way, but it's almost like trends in branding, right? And the evolution of the discipline itself also drives changes internally. So the growth and change of the company, as well as the growth and change of the discipline. I can remember us not thinking about customer experience. And then all of a sudden we had a whole team, a quality action team, doing all sorts of research around what was our experience and how did people perceive it. And so I think it's this evolution of the discipline that we tried to be leaders in, to grab onto that and say, okay, you know what, that really makes sense. And that is really who we are and what we're trying to be. And then, we had a mission as a company more around operational excellence. And we were like, yes, but what's our North Star as a brand? What do we want to, not operationally, but as a business, where are we headed, and what, from a customer looking perspective, where do we want that to sit, and how do we want that to live, and how do we want to really own it as not just the brand team, but how do we want to own it as FedExers, to deliver on it? So if we're trying to be like when we acquired FedEx Office, or it was Kinko's at the time, like, all right, we want to be the back office for service professionals. So how do we tell that story? And how do we get people to believe that we can be that given who we are in other sectors and other markets? So it's this whole idea around the changes drove other changes.
It's kind of like what Gabe said at the start of things, right? That you've had the chance to see the business evolve as the practice and the discipline of brands evolve.
That's right.
So let's dig into this ethos piece, because that's probably the most common element that so many brand leaders need to work through, which is trying to get to that North Star. And the big challenge that we often hear, I know, Holly, you face this when you were at Sienna as well, is that in engineering or operations or sales-led organization, these words can start to seem quite fluffy and just become a marketing idea. Take us back into the time machine and some of the stories or conversations or realities or learnings where who you had to convince, or things that you thought were going great, and in reality you realize that, oh no, this isn't, they're not getting it, or someone's going to shoot this initiative in the head.
Yeah, I'll never forget being asked to pull together a group of people around the globe, marketers, it's a global company, to come together to really redefine our brand, to really think about who we were and where we were going in that North Star. So we all came together in New York. We went through 2 days of, with a moderator and someone helping us get to all these core ideas and breakout groups. And it was really about the business, right? And how the brand would speak to the business and what changes the business needed to make to deliver on the brand. And we got back to Memphis, and I got a call and said, come see me. And I was like, okay. So I go into the office, and I hear, that was not at all what I wanted. So we had just spent, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars probably, bringing people in from around the world, having 2 days worth of sessions. And really what was being asked of me was update the brand identity, change our visual expression, change our voice. It really wasn't about what I thought it should have been about, which is the session I set up, which was about what are we doing and how are we delivering on the brand, and what decisions or actions should we take in the business if we want to be the brand that we say we want to be. So that was the first time where I thought, maybe we are not building the bridge the same way. We're both building, but we're not getting it's not aligning.
I think that context and definition is absolutely critical, because it's very easy for us to get idealistic, to your point, and say that's what we should be doing. And you might have a chance to get there at some point, but maybe not in that moment. Maybe, what is that
maybe
lesson
never.
learned? Have you,
maybe never.
or maybe never.
I think the lesson learned for me was, let's talk about what you mean about evolving the brand. Let's globally, let's talk about what you expect the outcome to be. Because I sent, here's objectives, here's an agenda, here's who's attending. I thought I had all my ducks in a row. And coming out of it, kind of the action items were really about, how do we build the castle on the hill, and what are the steps to get us there so that we are delivering on that? And that was not at all what was then the outcome. So that work and that time and that money just kind of was a big flush. And we started over and then really evolved our verbal and visual expression to be more current with who and what we were doing as a company, and being able to communicate a more modern FedEx, which I think is valuable, but without some of the business changes, I think it's a little bit hollow.
It's a really interesting tension point, isn't it? Where this notion that we see brand as an opportunity to drive transformation, and we want to act and behave more in the context of thinking as business transformation people, and we don't always have that permission.
Yeah, correct. I think that's the lesson.
And part of my takeaway also is, what are you saying, that not everybody reads the pre-materials and review? I think maybe embedded in what you said is the importance of, you need to go and have some of those. Do you need to go and have some of those one-on-ones before the workshop as well? Don't assume that okay, people are just going to read it.
That's right. That's right.
Do you think that, but did it plant a seed? I mean, one thing I'm curious about is it worth doing? So for anybody out there who's in an organization like that, if they're in that point of the company's trajectory where the business is not necessarily ready to change from an operational standpoint, but they want the brand to work harder. And sometimes that's an incongruous, that's a challenge, right? It's like we've got to bring everything along or we're not going to be authentic in what we say. Would you say that how do people chip away at that? How can they begin to widen others' perceptions in an organization of what brand can and should be responsible for?
Well, I kind of think it's chicken or the egg, and maybe this is back, not answering your question directly, Holly, but do you use communications and marketing and branding as the hammer to try to drive some of the business changes? Right. Or do you try to drive changes in the business that then you communicate through branding and marketing and so? Mm-hmm. So I think it's chicken or the egg, and I think understanding in your organization what's required, chicken or egg, does using the pull of the change of the communication, the branding, the expression, help drive the business changes? Or do you really need them to happen so that you then can communicate them? And I just think you need to understand in your organization what works.
Yeah, well, the challenge is then in potentially, as you said, the expectation was you'd be updating guidelines, right? That you would be, sort of dealing with the brand system, if you will.
Correct. No, exactly.
And I'm wondering if you felt like, well, how did we agree on these objectives? Do you think that there's something, one of the things I wondered a lot about, and if you had to pivot on this, I'd be so curious to know, where you have to write objectives differently because you can get other executives nodding along like, oh yeah, these objectives sound right. And then 4 slides later, you're off the rails again. So what did you learn about speaking their language? Did it cause you to change how you sort of set the context for things?
Well, I didn't go down that road again because I'd already landed in a ditch and I just wanted to stay out of the ditch.
One fit and twice die.
Right. We had a lot of fun that weekend, which was good, but we didn't really get to an end result for the business. I think it's about, I think what Gabe said is right. People are not always reading the pre-read and they have an idea in their mind. And even if they read it, contextually, what they believe is going to happen is aligned with what their expectation was. And what I wrote down to try to get clarity on was what I understood from the, initial discussion. Obviously, I was wrong, and I'll just own that. Or I didn't understand what was being requested. So I think it was it's really, it's a life lesson. People don't read the pre-reads. If they have an idea in their mind, their expectation is even your agenda delivers that, right?
What were some of the things that you did over the time that you were at FedEx related to socialization and relationship building and having those conversations outside of the workshops and the formal meetings, whether it's over coffee? Was that a part of your strategy and the time that you would spend? How much of that was deliberate, and how would you approach some of that?
I think for me, it was really around aligning around the globe and really understanding the positioning of our brand in the different markets and working as closely as I could with my peers across the regions and trying to learn as much as I could. Sometimes that was in a meeting, sometimes that was over Zoom, sometimes that was when they were in town having tea. We're big tea drinkers at FedEx. So, over a cup of tea, having a conversation that really enlightened me and helped me have a new and different perspective of the company overall and of our brand and its, our positioning in the world. And then using sounds like such a bad word, but using those relationships to help drive change, because, there were some of my peers who had relationships with some of my leaders. I had relationships with some of their leaders. So really working together, getting on the same page as a brand organization, and then working our network throughout the company and coming at it with the same message, but from different perspectives. So aligning across the globe made it easier for us to get things done because we could say the same things to different people, maybe in a way that was more relatable because of our role or because of our geographic location, that would then help us build consensus. FedEx is very much a consensus building organization. Build that consensus and move forward because we were all on the same page and collectively got our leaders on the same page.
So how can you get to a singular brand idea for an organization that is so global? So everyone's you're going to have the classic, well, that's not going to work in our market, that's too US centric, and then you factor in all the acquisitions where you've got all these different business unit leaders thinking about their own specific business or audience. No one, you're the only person that's thinking about what's better for the corporate entity. Everyone else is just thinking about themselves.
I think it's around adaptability and about modulation that makes sense for the business where it is, right? Who are they? What are they doing? And what should they be saying about it in terms of their market, but then also how that fits into the umbrella of the brand. You know, for a long time, many of our markets internationally didn't have intra-country. So like you couldn't ship something from Nice to Paris, but you could from Paris to Madrid. And so understanding that they didn't have intra-country service, but had across-the-country service, that'd be like saying, you know, in New York, you couldn't ship it upstate to Manhattan, which is odd to think about. But understanding where we were in those markets and in our services, and understanding how they'd have to modulate their messaging because of their capabilities is also critical. But knowing that has to be a part of the whole, right? The sum of the parts has to be greater than the whole. So how does that piece help tell our story, but tell in a way that's modulated and relevant for that market and for those capabilities?
Well, what about when there was something that I'm curious if you stumbled upon an outlier in any of those conversations, and that's happened to me and other peers of ours who have said, you know, I got through 7 out of 12 conversations and then was stopped cold because in Southeast Asia, the objective or the customer is so different from the mothership. So talk us through any sort of rough edges that you had to smooth, and how did you do that?
Well, I just remember one time somebody came to us and said they wanted to do like a FedEx superhero action figure. And I was like, what? And guess what? We let them do it, but it was Asia. It was so it's really just understanding cultural nuance and differences and what's acceptable. You know, I think people in the U.S. might have laughed if we had put out an action figure FedEx superhero. You know, think of how braggadocious, for lack of a better word, you know, that would be, and chest beating and how it doesn't really fit, I think, our brand, right? Our brand is a little more professional, a little more, I hate to use this word, but sterile, you know, a little more serious. And so that felt kind of way off brand to me, but it didn't feel off brand in Asia. And, you know, even as global as the world is, that action hero never got to the US except on my desk, fortunately. But, you know, I'm going to say this because this is probably an unfair advantage that many people don't have. The chairman of the company understands branding and understands the importance of branding and the importance of the consistency of who we are around the world. That helped me unfairly, that many people in organizations probably don't have. And I fortunately had, you know, an open dialogue with him very frequently. And so that is not a fair, I'm just going to go and you know, I had the card and I played it.
Some do. Yeah, it was a huge enabler for you. How would he talk about it, Monica? Like if he was talking to other CEOs and he's talking about the importance of brand, what kind of language, or how would he talk about it, or whether it's kind of to the others in the organization, or if he had a leader who didn't quite get it?
Well, that's a really interesting. I don't know that I saw him speak to a lot of other CEOs. Most of our discussions were internal. And I mean, he talked about brand.
But hypothetically, how would he talk about it and frame it?
Well, I mean, I would say, and again, I can't speak for him because the guy's brilliant and started a company that, employs 600,000 people worldwide. I mean, think about that. I think he understood that the foundation and that our brand is really an expression of our business. And he understood the criticality of that, he would call with a question. I remember one time he was talking to a group of team members. I think some media might have been there when we did the Kinko's acquisition. And he said something to the effect of like, here's the new identity and here's the new, he got down to the details. Here's the new font that we're going to use, and we're going to be changing that font on all of our other operating companies as well. And I was like, oh yeah, we didn't know that. We didn't think that. I mean, ideally that would have been where we would have gone. But I mean, he just showed the new identity. It had a new font, kind of a sans serif typeface, much more modern, much more current. And then it was his immediate next step to think visually that we were going to make that change across all of our other operating companies so that we would drive consistency and bring them into this, more modern place. And so it's, again, an unfair advantage. And and I used it because he was so visual and understood the importance not only of that visual consistency, but of delivering on our brand around the world. And I think he would say delivering on our brand promise. I mean, on all of our paychecks, it said, I will make every FedEx experience outstanding, right? He understood the value of that, and that if we collectively didn't do that, we wouldn't be delivering on our brand. So when you have that kind of firepower, the chairman.
And maybe that's the better question, Monica, like the example you gave is, what were some of those moments? You just gave a great example of one, but I'm wondering if there are any other that stuck to mind where whether in an internal meeting or a situation where he did something where you were able to sit back, cross your arms, put your head back and just smile and go, wow, he gets it. The example you just gave is a great one. Any others come to mind?
Yeah, one where we were in a meeting and someone, a senior leader, asked, well, does that mean that we're not going to allow people to do this? And I didn't have to say anything. And he said, that's right. That's exactly what we mean, because we have guardrails and we have an expression of our brand. And to say we are going to do something is to say we're not going to do something else. And I was like,
that's powerful.
Yeah. Basically, he said, of course, that's what she's saying. It also feels pretty good to get that kind of support, right? And it's like, okay, it's done.
Were there ever times where you had to pull in some air cover? Because in a massive organization like FedEx, sometimes you have a CEO who gets it, but maybe you have lieutenants or the VP level or that kind of frozen middle management. So maybe who don't get it, and sometimes you as a brand leader might come into conflict with that team, and you need some of that air cover, or you need that North Star. Did you ever need to do that, or was FedEx culture so top down, it was so clear that no, everyone got it?
Well, it wouldn't be fair to say I never had conflict with another VP in the organization over something related to brand. I mean, that's just crazy. I think I always try to work with people. I always try to work to say yes and work to get to yes. I think what I always try to do was help me understand what you're trying to achieve, and we'll find a way within the brand to get to yes, rather than just saying no. Nobody wants to be the police. I hated being the police. And there were times where it was easy to say, or someone would ask, well, where is that in the guidelines? Give me a ruler. And I was like, that is not who I am. That is not the world I want to live in. I can remember one time somebody put ducks on a poster and wrote cheap, cheap on it. And I was like, who is doing this? And why do they think it's our brand? This is one of those moments where I was like, you obviously don't get the brand if you think we could put rubber ducks on a poster and write cheap, cheap on it. Maybe what they were trying to say is there's a less expensive way to ship, or we have a more affordable economy service. And so I kept saying, what are you trying to say? And let's find a way that's on brand to say it. Cheap, cheap, and, rubber ducks is not at all consistent with the FedEx brand. Wasn't then, isn't now. I would assume will never be. And so, I had, conflicts all the time. People wanted to put co-brands. I keep going back to Office. That was a big acquisition, and it was different if you think about differences, whenever, Holly, you probably experience this a ton. People in the organization come and say, but I'm different. But I was like, well, you have FedEx in your name. I guess you're not that different. But everybody's different. So they'd say, we're retail, so we're different. And they wanted to co-brand in the store. And I was like, we can do that. Let's not do it the way that you want to do it. Like, let's find a way that works for the brand and the other brand, but also works under our umbrella. And typically, it might go a level above us, but we didn't typically have to call in, the chairman to tell anybody they couldn't do it.
Did that force you to get even more clear about the brand tenets? Because you couldn't afford to, you didn't want to play cop, nor could you afford to, right? You can't have eyes in the back of your head thinking about, and Gabe and I were talking about the sheer number of surfaces where your brand shows up. I mean, it is almost ubiquitous, right? It's like a Starbucks. And how you sleep at night. Tell us how do you set up a system that allows you to not worry all the time? And I'm curious if you had sort of a forgiveness rule, like, hey, an 80-20 thing. Like, I need 80% of this to be right, but I'm going to allow 20% of it, to veer. Or, how did you manage to get sleep at night with such a huge ecosystem?
There were some nights I didn't sleep, just to be honest, because it is huge, right? And to get your hands around it. But we did a lot of touch point studies too, to understand, the highest value touch points.
Sure.
And so for me, it was around, let's figure out, like, our drivers are one of the highest value touch points at FedEx. And so is their uniform right? And what can we do to ensure that they're, and then interestingly, and when I used to travel with the first brand director ever, we'd see people out of uniform and she'd say, hey, what's your name? What's your employee number? And I was like, woo, or we'd see a truck that had been wrecked and she'd get the vehicle number off of the truck and she would send it, off to the vehicle team and say, hey, this truck needs to be fixed. And because she was the first and the longest tenured, she had a lot of, I'll call her Gail Seds. Like, she could say this needed to happen and it would happen. And I remember thinking, that is not going to happen if I'm in that role. And so it really was, to your point, Holly, what are the most important touch points and what can we do to try to make those right most of the time? I mean, think about the nights I didn't sleep. One of the nights I didn't sleep was when the video of the courier threw a TV over the fence, onto the ground. And while that's an operations issue, it's a brand issue because that's what people think about a brand. And so it's like, let's get those delivering your package and the courier coming to your house. I mean, think about that, or your business. That's a really high value touch point. They've got to deliver the right service and they've got to look the right way. I mean, think if somebody comes to your house in a blank truck with no uniform on. Do you trust them? Does that build confidence? Do you think they really are who they say they are? Or do you think they're there to, take something out of your garage? And so really trying to get it right. And I remember at that point, we put labels inside of the truck that said, is your uniform on? Do you, do not throw a package. Remember, there are cameras everywhere that will catch you. Like, just a little reminder as they were going into the truck on these really high value and important things. You cannot police it all. I also had really good working relationships with our operating companies and would work with, and usually it was maybe the comms person or someone in a leadership role, but that understood marketing and comms, who worked within that business unit. So someone would come to me and say, okay, we're hiring all of these temporary additional vehicles. We're renting them at the holidays so that we can be sure that we can meet our customers' demand. But they're not going to be branded. And I was like, well, is the person driving them going to be branded? Can we add magnets on those vehicles as a short-term way to ensure people that it is our brand and we are delivering? So just working to try to find solutions that are amenable, affordable, and will really solve for the bigger concern without it being the best or the ideal, because you can never get to ideal, I don't think.
I want to double click on a couple of things here. One, there's what you talked about, this touch point importance exercise. That sounds an awful lot like kind of journey mapping. Is that really what it was? Or maybe can take us under the hood into what was the process and the approach to get to that touch point importance? And what's the output of that? Like, is that a number? It's like, oh, this one's an 8, this one's a 3?
Yeah, kind of. It was kind of relative, right? Not an 8 or a 3, but more like this came up as the most important and maybe the most expensive to change, right? And this one came up as the least important, but maybe the least expensive to change, and everywhere in between, and kind of put it on a grid and said, you know what, this top quartile is what we need to focus on. And these experiences, these visual expressions, these verbal expressions, they're the most important. So how do we start there? All of them are important, but these are relatively the most important.
And I imagine that with a business that serves so many different audiences as well, because you've got the consumer, you've got business, even within business, you've got different service lines. How did you decide which ones to focus in on first? Was it based on like looking at revenue splits? Like, okay, well, we're going to take the top 5 by revenue, or sometimes where I've heard is that you focus on the ones you might have some NPS data or some other data where you say, this is an area of the business where we know there's a bit of an experience or brand problem.
We really used the research to tell us what was important. It was from a customer perspective. What was important to customers and what did they value the most? And so we did it on importance and value from the customer's perspective, because revenue split would say, well, then we don't need to do anything for small businesses, or their voice doesn't need to be heard, right? Because, and that's completely not appropriate. So it was really about the cross-section of customers. And you'd be surprised how aligned, whether they were a really large customer or a very small customer, or even a retail customer, how aligned they were on what experience and which touch points mattered most to them and which ones were the most valuable to them. Because if you think about it, we're all individuals, whether we work at a business or work for ourselves or go into a retail store, we're all individuals. So our perception of that touch point and the value and importance can be very similar, unless you're just an outlier in some way.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the almost like the start of the conversation, in order to even have permission to do this type of work and study, you have to have that cross-functional alignment, because to your point, yes, great, you built great relationship with the comms team within one of the business unit, but like I said, many of these things, in order to fix them, they're going to be operational. So did you have those teams involved from the very start? What was that process and approach to get that alignment, any kind of learnings or insights for others? Because I'm sure there's a lot of brand leaders who would want to do that work, but they can't get their ops or customer service or IT team to participate, or they know that if they do it, they've got their own priorities.
That is so true. They do have their own priorities. I think for us, we did a program called Brando, and it was really around getting the frontline involved in what was important to them and what their barriers and challenges were and how we could help them, and then to tell them how they could help us, right? So we went in and interviewed a bunch of couriers, have the touch point study, know what's important, then what are the barriers to doing this? You know, they might have needed new uniforms. They might have needed funding for uniforms. Well, that's an operational concern that is certainly a brand concern. And so being able to go to bat and say, if we're going to deliver on this for customers, these things that are important in this upper quartile, here are the things that we're either going to have to invest in or we're going to have to change. And like that little label kind of that we put inside the vehicles kind of came out of that idea. Well, you know, putting a label inside of a truck is not very expensive, but can be a very nice reminder of what's expected on that delivery. You know, and so it's finding the path of least resistance that gives you the most return, and figuring out who to work with within the organization that can help enable that.
So that label in the truck is that label in the truck is the equivalent of what you hear sometimes, where it's like, oh, you've got the mission on the back of the badge.
Yeah,
that's right. That's exactly right. But in this case, it was much more tactical, right, and applicable for them in the moment of delivery, which is what we heard was very important and very valuable. So it's finding the opportunity in the moment at that point that would help with that. Remember, you're on camera. Remember, people are looking at your uniform. Do not toss a package. Like in the moment, it was the delivery, in the moment.
And why was the program called Brando?
Brando. Yeah. I don't know. We made it up. But, Brando's kind of a cool name.
As in like Marlon Brando.
Right.
Oh,
as in like Marlon.
Great. Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
You were giving it a persona and a name. You were kind of ahead of the game in this age of creating avatars or chatbots. You were thinking ahead.
Creating a brand couldn't refuse.
Yeah, exactly.
Monica, this has been an absolutely wonderful start to our series. Amazing learnings, and thank you for being on with us. That is it for today's show. We started this podcast because we know that you are not alone in the challenges that you face. And the likelihood is that somebody somewhere has dealt with the same obstacles you're facing and might have even found a way to solve for it. For that reason, we've also created a community of brand leads who meet on a regular basis to share and learn from each other. So if you'd like to join that community or are interested in learning more, or if there is a brand challenge you'd like us to cover in one of our future episodes, please do get in touch with us at gabriel@brandenabled.co. That's gabriel@brandenabled.co. If you like today's episode, please share it with your colleagues and friends and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.